Eunice, a young woman with a bright future, finds herself in the center of an unimaginable medical mystery. When intense pain reveals strange objects inside her body. With her mother's unwavering determination, the support of Joy, her funny best friend, and a resilient medical team led by Dr. Grace, Eunice fights to uncover the truth. As secrets of illegal experiments and betrayal surface, this tale of courage, love, and justice will leave you inspired and on the edge of your seat. Eunice clutched her stomach, her face twisted in pain as she doubled over on the couch. "This can't be normal," she muttered to herself, beads of sweat trickling down her forehead. When the pain worsened, her cousin Joy rushed her to the hospital in a panic, saying, "Eunice, don't die on me, oh. If you die, I'm not explaining anything to your mother." The car sped through the dimly lit streets, and Eunice groaned, half laughing at Joy's dramatic outburst despite the pain. By the time they arrived, Eunice was wheeled into the emergency room. Dr. Grace, a no-nonsense yet kind doctor, assessed her. "Eunice, where exactly does it hurt?" she asked. Eunice could only gasp, "Everywhere." The scans were ordered immediately, and as the beeping machines hummed, Dr. Grace's expression grew tense. "We need to operate," she said firmly. Eunice, half conscious, mumbled, "Just take it out, whatever it is." Dr. Grace and her team worked tirelessly in the operating room. What they found left them speechless. 7 large, shell-like objects were lodged in Eunice's womb. "Are we sure this is human anatomy we're dealing with?" one doctor whispered to another. Grace silenced them with a sharp look. "Focus on removing them safely," she ordered, but her own mind swirled with questions. When Eunice woke up hours later, she squinted at Dr. Grace, who was standing by her bedside. "What did you find?" "Please don't tell me it's twins. I don't even have one boyfriend, talk less of 2. Dr. Grace hesitated before replying, "Not twins, Eunice. 7 strange objects. We are not sure what they are." Eunice's jaw dropped. "Wait, 7. Did I swallow a hen by mistake?" After surgery, Eunice spent a few days in the hospital recovering. The pain subsided, and her cousin Joy showed up with a bag full of snacks. "If we are paying hospital bills, we might as well enjoy it," Joy quipped, munching loudly on chips as Eunice rolled her eyes. They laughed, momentarily forgetting the seriousness of the situation. Despite the humor, Dr. Grace remained concerned. "We've sent the objects for lab testing," she informed Eunice during her rounds. "But I suggest you stay here for further observation." Eunice waved her off. "Doctor, I'm fine now. I'm going home to binge-watch some movies. This hospital is too quiet, it's not good for my health." Barely 2 days after being discharged, Eunice was back in the emergency room. This time, the pain was worse. She clutched the side of the hospital bed, moaning. Joy ran after the stretcher, yelling, "Eunice, don't die, oh. Your mom will finish me if anything happens." Despite the agony, Eunice managed a weak laugh, whispering, "Stop shouting, Joy. You'll scare the other patients." The doctors ordered another scan, and what they saw made Dr. Grace's stomach drop. "This can't be possible," she whispered. Eunice, hearing the fear in her voice, gritted her teeth and demanded, "What is it now? Am I carrying a dinosaur this time?" Dr. Grace didn't laugh. "We found something strange again. I'll explain after more tests." Eunice sat in her hospital bed, arms crossed, glaring at Dr. Grace. "Doctor, you're scaring me. What did you find?" Dr. Grace hesitated before replying, "It looks like some kind of infestation." "It's not normal, Eunice. We need to act fast." Eunice blinked. "Infestation? Like ants or what?" The seriousness of the doctor's expression silenced her jokes. That night, Eunice's mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, arrived. Eunice, what is this nonsense I'm hearing? Eggs. Infestation. Are you laying chickens now? She scolded. Eunice groaned, covering her face. Mom, not you too. Just pray for me. I'm already scared enough. Despite the tension, Eunice couldn't help but laugh when Joy whispered, if these doctors can't solve it, maybe we need a chicken farmer to help. The medical team conducted more tests, but every result left them with more questions. Eunice's scans showed no abnormalities beyond the strange objects they had already removed. Her vitals are fine, one doctor noted. Dr. Gray sighed. Nothing about this case makes sense. Meanwhile, Eunice and Joy tried to pass the time. Joy dramatically pretended to faint whenever a nurse entered the room, making Eunice laugh despite herself. Stop clowning, Joy, Eunice said, trying to sound stern. But Joy grinned. If the doctors can't explain your condition, I might as well provide entertainment. Dr. Grace called for a meeting with her colleagues, determined to find answers. We need to think outside the box, she insisted, pacing the room. The younger doctors exchanged uneasy glances. What kind of box are we talking about, doctor? One joked nervously. Dr. Grace glared. The box where we solve this mystery before we lose a patient. Meanwhile, Eunice, tired of being stuck in her hospital room, turned to Joy. Let's sneak out and find the kitchen. I'm craving jollof rice. Joy raised an eyebrow. You want to limp through the hallways in your hospital gown? That's how horror movies start. Eunice laughed but slumped back in bed. Fine, bring me rice when you find some. Eunice's mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, returned with a bag of home-cooked food. Here, eat this. Hospital food is for chickens, she declared, unpacking steaming plates of jollof and fried fish. Eunice's face lit up. Mom, you're the real MVP. Joy snatched a plate for herself, grinning. This is why I stick around. As they ate, a nurse entered with test results. Dr. Grace wants to discuss this with your family, she said. Mrs. Elizabeth wiped her hands dramatically. Let me sit properly and hear this nonsense. If they don't have answers, I'll ask them for a refund. Eunice and Joy burst into laughter, but the tension was clear. Dr. Grace sat across from Eunice and her family, her face serious. We suspect the objects in Eunice's womb may not be biological. Are they synthetic? Eunice blinked. Wait. Are you saying I'm a robot? Like Terminator? Dr. Grace couldn't help but smile. No, Eunice. We believe they could have been implanted, but we don't know how or why. Mrs. Elizabeth folded her arms. So you're saying someone planted something in my daughter? Where? In the market. Joy whispered to Eunice, maybe you ate too much rice, and this is. Eunice elbowed her but couldn't hide her chuckle. Doctor, just tell me this, am I safe or not? That night, Eunice woke up screaming. The pain had returned with a vengeance. Nurses rushed in as Joy stumbled out of her chair, yelling, do something. My daughter is in pain. Mrs. Elizabeth looked helpless, clutching Eunice's hand. You'll be fine, my child. You're stronger than this. As the doctors administered pain relief, Eunice whispered, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Dr. Grace promised to run another scan. We'll get to the bottom of this, Eunice. I won't give up on you. Eunice managed a weak smile. Just make sure you don't give me a bill that makes me cry more. The new scan revealed something even more bizarre, tiny fragments moving inside Eunice's body. Dr. Grace frowned, zooming in on the images. This looks like microscopic devices, she muttered. Her colleague stared at her. Are you suggesting nanotechnology? Dr. Grace shook her head. I don't know what to suggest anymore. When Eunice was informed, she groaned. First eggs, now robots. What's next? A spaceship in my liver. Joy chimed in, honestly, if you start glowing in the dark, I'm selling tickets. We'll make millions. Eunice laughed despite herself. At least someone's making money from this. Mrs. Elizabeth decided she'd had enough. We can't just sit here and wait. Something is behind this, and I'll find out. She called Eunice's closest friends and family, gathering information about her recent activities. Joy took notes, pretending to be a detective. Okay, so who's the prime suspect? That shady suya seller down the street. Eunice shook her head, laughing weakly. Mom, please don't embarrass me. Just focus on finding answers. Mrs. Elizabeth nodded. Don't worry, my child. Nobody messes with my family. Joy whispered to Eunice, your mom should start her own crime show. In her search, Mrs. Elizabeth remembered something strange. Eunice's ex-boyfriend, Richard, had reappeared in her life briefly months ago. He had been secretive, avoiding direct questions about his sudden wealth. Mrs. Elizabeth frowned. I always knew that boy was trouble, she muttered. When she mentioned Richard to Eunice, her daughter's face darkened. I haven't seen him in months, Mom. You think he's involved in this? Mrs. Elizabeth pursed her lips. I don't know. But I'll find out. Joy leaned over. Plot twist, Richard is actually a scientist. Eunice rolled her eyes but couldn't shake the unease. Dr. Grace ordered another scan, hoping to find answers about the moving fragments inside Eunice. This time, the images revealed something even stranger. These fragments are multiplying, she said softly, staring at the screen. The team exchanged nervous glances. Eunice, tired of being left in the dark, snapped, Doctor, just tell me the truth. Am I going to turn into a robot or not? Dr. Grace smiled gently. You're not turning into anything, Eunice. But we need to act fast before this spreads further. Mrs. Elizabeth tracked down Richard to his new apartment. When he opened the door, he looked surprised but not entirely shocked to see her. Mrs. Elizabeth. What brings you here? He asked, feigning politeness. Mrs. Elizabeth didn't mince words. What did you do to my daughter, Richard? Richard's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice low and firm. Listen to me, boy. If you're behind this, I'll find out. And you'll regret it. Richard smirked but said nothing, closing the door. Mrs. Elizabeth left, more suspicious than ever. Back at the hospital, Dr. Grace received the lab results from the fragments removed during Eunice's last scan. These aren't natural, the technician said. They are artificial structures. And they are still active. Dr. Grace's stomach tightened. This was unlike anything she had seen before. When Eunice heard the news, she sighed. So what's the plan, doctor? Do I have to live with this, whatever it is? Dr. Grace nodded. We'll figure out a way to stop it. But for now, we need to monitor you closely. Joy joked, looks like you're stuck with me, Rumi. Eunice laughed weakly. Dr. Grace gathered Eunice, Mrs. Elizabeth, and Joy in the consultation room. The lab results had confirmed an unsettling truth: the fragments inside Eunice's body were artificial and self-replicating. This is not normal biology, Dr. Grace explained, her voice calm but firm. We are dealing with something advanced. Eunice frowned. Advanced? Like what? Robots? Aliens? Please, doctor, just tell me what's going on. Joy, ever the comedian, leaned over and whispered, maybe you're the first Nigerian superhero. They'll call you Iron Womb. Despite the tension, Eunice burst out laughing. Mrs. Elizabeth, however, wasn't amused. "This is serious, Joy. And doctor, we need answers. Now." That evening, Mrs. Elizabeth received an unexpected call from Richard. His voice was tense. "I don't know what you think I've done, but you need to stop digging into my life." Mrs. Elizabeth wasn't intimidated. "If you're innocent, why are you so defensive?" she shot back. Richard paused, then said something chilling. "You're playing with fire, and it's going to burn you. Leave this alone." Mrs. Elizabeth hung up, her resolve only strengthening. She told Eunice what had happened. "He's hiding something. I can feel it," she said. Eunice, trying to lighten the mood, replied, "Mom, if this is a movie, you'd be the detective that everyone underestimates until the last scene." Dr. Grace brought in a team of specialists to examine Eunice. "We're dealing with technology that's far beyond anything we've seen," one of the experts remarked. They hypothesized that the fragments might have been introduced through a medical procedure or even something ingested. Meanwhile, Eunice joked with Joy about the situation. "Maybe I should start charging these doctors rent. They're always here." Joy grinned. "Or start a YouTube channel. Life with Eunice, how to be the most confusing patient ever." Their laughter eased the heavy atmosphere, if only for a moment. Eunice began reflecting on her past, trying to piece together any event that might explain her condition. She remembered a minor surgery she had undergone a year ago to remove fibroids. Could something have gone wrong then? "Mom, do you think it's connected to that surgery?" Eunice asked. Mrs. Elizabeth frowned. "I don't trust these so-called doctors anymore. If they planted something in you, I'll find out." Joy added, "If they planted something, it better not be beans. I'm tired of weird surprises." Despite the humor, Eunice couldn't shake her unease. Eunice's condition worsened that night as the pain returned with full force. She screamed as nurses rushed in, administering sedatives to calm her. Mrs. Elizabeth prayed aloud, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. Joy stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face. "Why does this keep happening?" she whispered. Dr. Grace arrived minutes later, examining Eunice. "Her body is reacting to the fragments again. We need to slow this down," she said urgently. Eunice, through gritted teeth, muttered, "Doctor, if I survive this, I want a free trip to the Bahamas. This stress deserves a vacation." Mrs. Elizabeth decided to revisit the hospital where Eunice had her previous surgery. She met with the surgeon, Dr. Adewale, who seemed uncomfortable when questioned. "I don't recall anything unusual during her procedure," he said, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Elizabeth wasn't convinced. On her way out, a nurse discreetly handed Mrs. Elizabeth a slip of paper. "If you want answers, meet me tonight," it read. Mrs. Elizabeth's heart raced. What secrets was this hospital hiding? That evening, Mrs. Elizabeth met the nurse in a quiet cafe. The woman looked nervous but spoke quickly. Dr. Adewale was part of a controversial project involving experimental implants. He never told patients about it. Mrs. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. "Are you saying my daughter was experimented on without her consent?" The nurse nodded. "I think so. But I don't have all the details. You need to dig deeper." Mrs. Elizabeth's hands trembled with anger. "Thank you," she said. "I won't let this go." Mrs. Elizabeth confronted Richard again, this time at his workplace. "I know about the experiments," she said, watching his face pale. "What do you know about my daughter's condition?" Richard hesitated, then sighed. "I didn't want this to happen. I had no choice." Eunice's mother stepped closer. "No choice? You mean you knew?" Richard avoided her gaze. It's more complicated than you think. But I swear, I didn't mean for her to get hurt. His vague responses only fueled Mrs. Elizabeth's determination. When Mrs. Elizabeth returned to the hospital, she told Eunice everything. Your surgeon was part of a shady project. And Richard might know more than he's admitting. Eunice stared at her mother in disbelief. So you're saying I'm the victim of some illegal experiment? Great. Just great. Joy tried to lighten the mood. Hey, maybe they gave you superpowers. Can you fly yet? Eunice rolled her eyes but managed a small smile. If I can fly, I'm flying out of this hospital first.
She gave me